We had fun today, me and Jordan. We talked about allegories and stories, and how if you take the New Testament and lay it over the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament stories just make a little bit more sense. It was about 40 minutes long. It was cool. Hope you guys enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the show without a name. If you have an idea for what to call it, please tell us. Leave a comment or something. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to YouTube. That's where we post all the fun stuff, so you'll have fun there. And talk with your friends and family about it. And when you have questions, please send them to us. And just leave us a message if you have a question throughout the week, because we can get those questions and then we'll go over them here. So without further ado, our guest today is a world champion podcast listener. He has been to more states than I have, and he was on the show Dallas, Mr. Jordan Weaver.
I literally should have just stood over there until you apologized for that.
Oh, sorry. Hello, Jordan.
Hi. How you doing?
How's your day going?
Fantastic. Yep. Now I'm hoping nobody has ever seen the show Dallas.
Oh, well, people have.
Okay.
Jordan, first thing, not the topic. I'm not introducing the topic. First thing, on ESPN.com, it says that Jordan Weaver has a field goal percentage of 46.7%.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, not every shot drops, but you do miss 100% shots. I don't know. I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, I have no idea who that is either. That's not Jordan.
My brother got really excited because he heard that there was a female gymnast going to the Olympics a few years ago named Jordan Weaver. He was like, yes! And then it turns out it was Jordan Weber, and it kind of ruined his thing. But we were close. Almost a famous name.
Very close. The topic today.
Can I just say that I think this might be a huge mistake? I'm starting to think that maybe I need them in advance because you're a smart enough guy. I'm realizing
the topics are deeper than you thought.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I just saw the title when it says allegories and stories.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say that, so you ruined it, but that's fine. Okay, ready?
It's right there.
I know. I'm saying the big reveal.
What is it?
Okay,
what
ready?
is it?
The stories is the topic is allegories and stories.
This is why I think it was a huge mistake. I wish I would have had some time to research.
The dictionary defines allegory as a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically moral or political one.
Yes.
And if you're wondering, allegory. That's what it sounds like. Yeah. Okay.
Real quick, this is off the cuff, but during the MLK movement, they used allegories with Brer Rabbit, because it was these stories, exactly what you're talking about. It was these stories of like how the tortoise would outsmart the rabbit. And then just all these, like, from a position of weakness, how to utilize a position of weakness towards a position of strength to get what you wanted out of it. And because of those stories or allegories, they were able to use those stories to connect to what the heart behind their movement, the civil rights movement, was. Yeah. And so like now I've like being thrown into a briar patch and things like that, things that, oh, please don't do that. Please, you're so powerful, don't do that. And that they were saying that during the MLK movement that it was actually allegories that kind of got them through as far as keeping on mission. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, they're everywhere in pop culture and just culture in general, not just pop culture. As you know, the Bible has a lot of stories.
Yes.
And you have taught that the stories of the Old Testament have a deeper meaning when you look at them through a lens of the New Testament. So one of those stories that I was curious about in Galatians 4:22 through 24. Why are you looking at me like that?
I just feel like you're going to ask me a question I don't know the answer to. I'm just preparing for how many different ways to say I don't know.
Okay, I see. No, it's good. Galatians 4:22 through 24. For it is written that Abraham, had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, is that how you pronounce it? Mm-hmm. Bearing children for slavery. This is Hagar, and it goes on. But the question is, what does Paul mean that the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah is an allegory? Is that, I mean...
I think I got an answer.
Yeah.
The Christian story and the Muslim story are actually the exact same story until right then. Because they say that, I mean, if you think about the story of Jesus, Jesus comes in to redeem sinful man back to himself, right? And that Jesus, here's like, think about this. Everybody's like, oh, Jesus was the Son of God, the physical Son of God, right? Well, technically, so is Adam, right? I mean, think about Adam. Who was Adam's parents? We know them to be a person, but we know that he was created flesh and blood. See what I mean? And so, in my understanding of it, that what we see in Hagar and Ishmael, which was the father of the Muslim faith, and Abraham, which was the father of the Christian faith, when they separate, here's what's so interesting to me, is that God sent an angel to go redeem Hagar and Ishmael, knowing full well that they were going to go on and create what would be the greatest resistance against Christianity on the globe, right? That all that God would have had to do is to remove that child from the earth, and the birth of the Muslim faith disappears. Now, if you're the average gun-toting American Christian, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the average military strategy would say, we'll take it out when it's only one person. And because like right now, we've got people that are at war right now with people in the radical Islamic faith. But when God had the opportunity, he brought her, Hagar, and Ishmael to a well and saved their lives, knowing that they would go on to create resistance to the Christian faith. So I wish I had, I mean, I like doing this because I don't have time to prepare, but I'm kind of thinking as I'm thinking out loud. But when you look at the fact that God loved us in our sin, it's the same God that loved Ishmael in what was essentially sin, because they weren't honoring the promise that God gave Abraham and Sarah, right? So the allegory in my mind would be that is still the story of Jesus, that he didn't come save the good for being good. He even saved the life of the bad who would go on to do bad, which means that God did not extend himself to only people he knew would accept it. That God, even into the Old Testament, was extending grace to people he knew full well would not be redeemed back to himself.
Yeah. So it's, and you said Muslim, what's the word that means what? Like law? Or you said the definition of the word Muslim means?
Yes. Yeah, I can't remember. I'd have to look that up. The word Muslim refers to law, and Isaac refers to, dang it, I wish, there's something to it though. Sure. There's something to it. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember.
Because, I mean, it says that one was born from flesh to be a generation of slaves, and then one was born from the free woman. Anyway.
Well, and there's the concept that sin always bears slavery. Right. That's what it always begats, is the word. And that's when Jesus says that you follow sin till death, that it leads to bondage and captivity and slavery and control, that when it starts in sin, that's the direction it goes. But that, how deep do you want to go on this?
Really
because, okay, so here's how we think of the enemy, right? The enemy is nice first, and then he gives you something. And then he goes, well, I did give you something, so in return, there's a request. And then if that request isn't met, you go, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, remember, I did something nice for you, and then there's a demand. And if the demand isn't met, then there's a threat. The enemy's like, here's what I'm going to do. There's a threat that says, because you didn't do what I asked you to do. And then if there's no compliance to the threat, then there's death. So there's the 5 steps.
Sure.
Kindness, request, demand, threat, death.
Okay.
Right? It's a Timothy Jennings concept, but it makes sense. But what's crazy is that we understand that that's how the enemy would work. We understand controlling people work that way. Manipulative people work that way. Like, I was nice to you, and you better do it. And if you don't do it, and even if it's just death of the relationship, even if it's not a physical death, like, get out of here. But here's what's crazy. If we're not careful, then what happens is we track the controlling nature of sin and the enemy. We recognize that that's bad, but then we see how often people go, well, Jesus loved you. And all he asks in return is this. And if you don't do that, then there's this, then there's a demand. And then if you don't, then guess what? There's hell. And if that isn't scary enough, then eternal damnation. Right. And we're like, wait a minute, hold on a second. So that means if we're not, as people, if we understand that sin, slavery, Christ, freedom, then what's crazy is how often we assign the same personal nature of the enemy to Jesus. We accuse him, and what instead, back to the slavery concept. Instead, what is interesting is that God's like, invite, seek, love, seek. But at the end, it's a choice. Sure. It boils down to a choice. If we understand that what God did for Ishmael by saving his life, that's proof that there's not a God of like demands and threats and all the manipulation that we assign to him.
Yeah. Submitter to God. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
Muslim means submitter, and Isaac meant wrestler.
Wrestler. That's right.
So we got a God who's saying, I'm going to name my children Israel. He named Isaac, who meant deceiver. Isaac meant usurper.
Sure.
That's what the name Isaac meant. No, I'm getting this wrong. Jacob.
Sure.
Jacob meant deceiver, usurper. And he said, I'm going to give you the name Israel. Israel meant wrestler. So Arabic was, oh, good job, Bo. Yep. Good job, Bo Lacey. But that's what the Arabic is, submitted to God. And that's what we're told we're supposed to be. Submit, which is that control. Like, you better submit, because if you don't submit, then God's going to curse you. And then wrestles with God. That's what God, the name that God gave his people was wrestles with God, which is what Jacob had done, which is like God's granting us this permission to say, hey, work through it with me.
Yeah.
There's not a demand. It's not me saying I'm going to control your thoughts and I'm going to control this and I'm going to threaten you and I'm going to kill you if you don't. He's saying work through it, dig through it. And when you find a difficult question, lean into that, because it's like what I said Sunday, when the font is made more difficult, there's a deeper revelation of Christ in the wrestling.
Yeah. I mean, and that's an allegory if you'll ever find one.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah. He's wrestling. He's literally wrestling with the person of Jesus.
Yeah. And I know the way you present the Bible is, through story, where you'll be, it's a concept, it's a teaching, but you say, imagine yourself in this scenario and how you would feel, and you really put emotion into that. And that's how I receive. I mean, I love stories. And so so you're
that's a coffee shop technique of our culture, though, because like if you go to the coffee shop in any small town, you're going to have somebody telling stories. Like we are storytellers. Like all the cowboy poetry, it's all storytelling. All the Western movies is storytelling. You look into like country songs, it's all storytelling. Everything that we do is about developing story. And so God, I know that's how God speaks to me, is that I'm in the middle of doing something and it's like a truth that I've been kind of wrestling with, all of a sudden falls into place and I go, oh, got it.
Yeah.
And if I can put it into a story, what that is, it's kind of like, it sounds, I don't know if this is going to make sense. It's almost like the needle that punctures our skin a little bit. It puts us under the surface where we're able to understand it. Because if I just threw Bible knowledge on a Sunday morning, maybe it'd be true, but it'd be boring. But you put it in a story, and that's what gets into us.
Yeah. Yeah. Meaning like I can read the Bible, but I still need help understanding it.
Right.
So on and so forth.
Well, what I think happens is once people start to understand the word through the concept of a story, then they don't need me to do it every single day. Like I can be a benefit on Sundays, but people start learning how to conceptualize the word after a period of time.
Yeah. What are some allegories that are stories telling about Jesus, but from like our generation?
Ask that again. I was jumping ahead, but I think I didn't understand. I changed it at the last minute in my head.
Like, what are some allegories telling about the story of Jesus, but set in like a movie or something of our generation?
Okay. My favorite thing, I actually recently handed this sermon off to a friend and he preached it, but I love it. It's my favorite story in the Bible. Is I'm going to tell you the story.
Okay.
And I'm going to go back and I'm going to explain what you just heard, because the story actually on its own is kind of confusing. But then if you understand that it's an allegory and what it actually meant.
Sure.
So the children of Israel are in the desert and they're coming to a place called Rephidim, and Rephidim is supposed to mean rest.
Okay.
And so if you can imagine like the end of a semester and you're like, just as soon as I get my finals done, as soon as I get my test taken, this semester is going to be over. Or like work on Friday night. Once I get Friday night, everything's going to be fine. Everybody's got like things they look forward to. Mm-hmm. They were looking forward to rest. They get to Rephidim and there's no water. And so they're frustrated. I'd have to look up where this is located, but they get to Rephidim, there's no water, so they're mad at Moses. And they do what everybody does. They're remembering back in Egypt. They're not remembering all the terrible things about Egypt. They're remembering that it was they didn't have to think. They were not allowed to think. They had a slave mentality, and that's a nature of God right there. It's like, hey, don't just group think. Like God, when he brought people out of group thinking slavery, back to Ishmael, when he brought people out of group thinking slavery, he said, think for yourselves, like lean on me, like relationally, let's snap out of the slave mentality. Anyway, so they get mad at Moses, and Moses, God tells Moses this. He says, take your staff, is always indicative of judgment. So see, there's the allegory right there. Take your staff, which was judgment. Bring your elders, that was going to be the jury. And he said, walk out here and I will stand before you. God says, I'll stand before you. Now, normally God would say, stand before me, because God's in the position of authority. But by saying to Moses, I'll stand before you as you stand, Moses, the law, holding judgment with the elders, which is the jury. And he said, strike the rock. Now, this is kind of a long setup, but you got to understand, like, the Bible says he struck the rock, water poured out, everybody drank. You fast forward later, they were out of water again. And Moses is so mad, he's so frustrated that he goes back to the rock and he strikes it, and he has to strike it twice. And when he strikes the rock twice, water pours out again. People have water. And God says, because of this, you're not going to be allowed to bring the children of Israel into the promised land. And then God ushers Moses to the top of the hill, and that's the end of Moses' story. Now, as confusing as that story could be, here's what we're looking at. When you understand that it was a trial and it was a jury, and God said, take your judgment and strike the rock. The rock was always Jesus. Jesus, the rock the builders rejected, the rock that, some stuff that build your house on the rock. Every time you hear Jesus referenced as a rock. So what God was saying was, judge me, the rock. And from that, it's broken. So the concept of Jesus being broken open, and water that was always indicative of blessings poured out for the people. So you're like, oh, that's amazing. Okay, so that's the story of Jesus. But then you go, okay, well then why the second time? What was going on the second time? Because he struck it twice. Here's what's amazing, is that Moses has always been representative of the law. So when God says, speak to the rock, God says, speak to the rock, and Moses can't bring himself to do it. He cannot speak to the rock. Instead, he strikes it. Speaking to the rock would have been it's a relational act of grace. Sure. There's this grace aspect to it, and the law cannot be the source of grace.
Sure.
For instance, if I was a judge, and Jacob walks in and goes, Mary stole $5 from me, and I, representing the law, go, hey, you know what? That's not a big deal. I've wronged you. The law is no longer just. Grace has to come from the person that's been wronged. You say, it's $5, I don't care, we're good. So if Moses represents the law, the teetering point of the law, and God says, demonstrate grace, out of who he was as his identity, he couldn't demonstrate grace. So he strikes the rock, and God says, it's a story. That's the story. There's the allegory. Like, I am going to allegory.
We were joking about this earlier because Jordan was like,
myself up.
Yeah, what if we say allergy instead of allegory? And then I was like, no, don't say it, because then we're going to say it.
So anyway, so by striking the rock, what he said is, I won't demonstrate grace. Well, what God did by ushering, it doesn't say that God was mad at Moses. He says, you are the law, and the law has its limitations. That, David said, I love the law. I love the law because it gives me an indication of God's desire for me. So it's not that the law is bad, but the problem is, by only following the law, it can take you out of a lot of captivity. It can take you out of a lot of addictions and bad habits. Sure. It can bring you forward out of a lot of bad into a lot of good, but you cannot step into the permanent, perfect call of God, the will of God for your life, using the law. That has to be grace. And when it came time for the law to demonstrate grace, Moses said, I can't do it. So what we now know is that Jesus, the story of Jesus was being told, even through the story of Moses, is that Moses goes, I can't be grace. And God goes, I know, I got it. Story's told, come with me. I'm now going to usher the children of Israel into the promised land, but it can't be the law that does that. That has to happen through grace.
Why is the Bible set up the way it is, with the, books in the certain way in the New Testament, the Old Testament, and that kind of stuff? Because I'm thinking it's not like a normal book. It's not like a normal story. So why? So when you say you can take the New Testament and lay it over the Old Testament, and it actually makes sense. Why is it set up like that?
Again, it's stuff I knew, but the Timothy Jennings concept, I'll explain it to you, but it finally made sense of how this works, is there's a flow change when Jesus shows up.
Right.
When I say a flow change, that the earth was suffering from a toxic snake bite of sin. That's what sin was, is it was a toxic killer, and we were going to die. And the anti-venom, being Jesus, had to be delivered to humanity. So if you go back to Noah, the window was closing, because if everybody forgot about God, even the person of Jesus showing up couldn't have been significant, because the scrolls and the prophecy and the promise, everything that God was going to do down through the ages was going to be disappeared, and he would have just been a blip on the map, and the story of Jesus could not have been what it was. It couldn't have been projected the way that it was. So God in the Old Testament knows that Jesus represents the antivenom. Jesus is going to be the cure to the sin that has ensnared us. So if you think of it like the anti-venom is on an airplane and it's coming, and we've got to clear the runway. The runway has to stay clear. Then in the Old Testament, the flow is to move the flow of what God's interaction with people was moving people off the runway. And as tragic as Noah's Ark was, think about how close the window was to closing. It says that Noah and his family, that was it. He had to act in a way that was protective. And I know this is hard to conceptualize, but what happens if the story of God disappears from the minds of people is that the anti-venom couldn't have landed. The runway would have been cluttered. The airplane couldn't have landed. So when Jesus shows up, what you see in the New Testament is the entire flow changes. Everything changes. In the New Testament, the plane has landed, the anti-venom has arrived, and now what God does is instead of clearing the runway so Jesus is possible, Jesus is here. Everything turns and comes back. Right. Now he's inviting in the Gentiles. Now he's loving the foreigners. Now he's speaking about himself in a way that's inviting instead of exclusive. So if you read the Old Testament, what's really difficult about that is the nature of God was preserving the possibility for Jesus. And in the New Testament, what you see is that God is inviting people. So when you take the New Testament and you lay it over the Old Testament, they speak to each other, even though the flow of traffic, the direction of traffic was different.
Yeah.
But going back to like the story of Moses, it proves that the plan was the plan all along.
Yeah. I mean, he could get it out to one family.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty good timing.
Well, and there's a story about when Samson's parents see the messenger of God ascend into the clouds and they said, we're going to die because we've seen God. There's these stories where people see God or wrestle with God that Jesus is appearing. I mean, look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What did the king say? He said, I see 4 men and the fourth one looks like the Son of God. So we saw Jesus physically appearing in the Old Testament, but the timing was according to fulfill all the prophecies that speak to the impossibility of Jesus. Yeah. There's no way possible. Either he was who he said he was, or the books have been retroactively written. Jesus has to be who he said he was, especially when you look at how the book was written, because they included details that made themselves look really bad. Right. The perfect plan of Jesus being born when he was born to become the anti-venom, but you still see, even throughout the Old Testament, the plan was always the plan.
Speaking of anti-venom, snakes in the desert, anti-venom, that's an allegory.
I love that one. Same thing. Anytime you see something in the Old Testament that it's like, what? If you dig down deep enough, usually there's Jesus at the bottom of it.
Right.
Because it says they started complaining and God sent snakes. So if you're reading this, you're like, what?
What a jerk.
Well, that's just how it's written. Yeah. It doesn't say that God took the snakes and sent them to the children. It just says that like everything that happened, God allows it. It's like, why is it raining? Well, God allowed it to rain. Or you could say God made it rain. But whatever the case may be, the way that it's written in the Old Testament was because they were grumbling and complaining and they knew that was against the will of God. They were actively in disobedience. Then when this starts happening, in their own minds, they connect it as causal. It's the correlation does not equal causation. It was a correlation of the snakes arriving, but it doesn't ever indicate that God sent it as punishment, but they assume that's what it was. They go to Moses and they say, we're getting bit by snakes and dying. God says, lift the serpent up on a pole. It's a bronze pole. Lift the bronze serpent up on a pole, and if people will look at it, they won't die when they're bit by snakes.
Right.
Now, you could read that and be like, what?
That no logical sense there.
Literally, every time somebody's like, I can't listen to the Bible. What is this? What is that? Well, two things is that everybody says, well, why the snake? Because the snake is a symbol of sin. Well, the Bible also says that he became sin. He became sin who knew no sin. Jesus, who knew no sin, became sin on the cross. The entire focus of all the punishment of sin was on Jesus on the cross. And so in the Old Testament, it was the serpent on the pole. That was a representation of Jesus. Now, here's where that's important. That story doesn't say the snakes quit biting people. They kept biting them.
Right.
They just quit dying. If they would look on the serpent, the story, if they would look at it, they would still get bit, but life would still be difficult. They would still go through trials. And you go, well, people still die today. Yes, but not eternally. Right. Like those that lean into the concept of Jesus, that built their house on the rock, they are bit by life. Life will still bite you. You're still going to go through things that seem unfair, but it's not permanent.
Yeah.
And the moment we get on the other side of eternity, we go, oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I got it. Well, that whole story makes more sense if you understand that even in the desert, those people died and had no clue who Jesus was.
Right.
Jesus didn't come around thousands of years later, but God was telling through these things, these stories, these demonstrations in the Old Testament that this was always the plan. Yeah. It was always the plan.
So what story are we a part of right now?
Grace.
Yeah.
We're in what's called the dispensation of grace. Moses was the dispensation of law. This is the dispensation of grace, which is the price has been paid. And I think that's what's so crazy is how often people don't realize that when we get to heaven, we're going to go, hey, what was it like on the ark? Hey, what was it like in the lion's den? And they're going to go, what was it like living with the Holy Spirit?
Yeah.
What was that like? What was it like with grace? What was it like living out from under the guilt and the weight of sin? And how sad that we are going to go, I guess we kind of didn't realize that.
Yeah.
We were so focused on the law and the rules. Like the miracle of the grace of God that we're living in right now, I think sometimes we forget it and we don't think about it.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, that is the miracle. Like, I get to live as though I've never done anything wrong. I get to love God and be loved by God as though I've done nothing wrong because of what he did on the cross.
Yeah. I mean, each one of our lives could be an allegory for Jesus.
Well, that's the thing is that, so after the resurrection, Jesus appears to the people and he starts showing them himself in all the scriptures. Right. It says that he starts demonstrating, here, this was me and this was me. David couldn't even be the perfect David. Saul couldn't be the perfect Saul. Abraham couldn't be the perfect Abraham. I'm the perfect, and I think that's the story that we're telling now is like, even in my life, as flawed and as broken and incomplete and all the things that I could criticize myself for, that God still looks at me as perfect based on the serpent hung on the cross.
Right.
That a love that I can't even grasp. Like, I can grasp being guilty or shameful. I can get that. If somebody says you're disgusting or you're awful, I could understand that. But to be forgiven and perfect and loved, like, that is a grace concept that if I would start believing, I would start demonstrating to people. And then all of a sudden I become the demonstration of Jesus in my circles.
Right.
In the same way that everybody in the Old Testament was a demonstration on some level of who Jesus would be, that's what we are today. Like that when we forgive somebody, what gives us the power to forgive? The only thing that gives me the power to forgive is the reality that I've been forgiven of so much more. Otherwise, how do I forgive? How do I get over it? We're in the middle of a Netflix show about the Unabomber. He never forgave anybody.
Okay.
Every slight, every insult, he remembered it. And he set out to bring justice. And what you see is he became the freaking Unabomber.
Yeah.
And you're like, dude, your whole life could have been so much easier if you would have I'm just going to let it go. What you see is like the forgiveness that God gives us allows a freedom. Otherwise, we're slaves to our anger. And that goes back to the Ishmael concept, which is that sin leads you to slavery.
Yeah. So if we can be allegories for Jesus's story without even realizing it, do you think people can make stories that are an actual allegory of Jesus without even realizing it in, movies?
That's what The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think, was targeting,
exactly.
Is when they say, is Aslan safe? And he goes, no, he's not safe, but he's good. And they're talking about the lion.
Yeah.
That's a truth concept about Jesus that people would have watched and be like, oh, that's awesome. Oh, lion, cool. He's a lion. He's powerful, but he's on our side. We don't have to make him less lion. Like, he's a lion, but he's for us. And then all of a sudden down the road, it's like that's what a parable was. That's what parables did, is Jesus told a story in a little ball and you didn't get it. And then you're walking along one day and this story falls open and you're like, oh, okay, there it is.
Yeah.
That people understand the concept of Aslan from the C.S. Lewis concept. I love that he's like, I'm going to tell you the story of Jesus, but I'm not going to say Jesus. And then later you're going to be walking down but I think that's when we love people. I mean, we kind of are the movie.
Right.
And that's what, when someone's like, repent or burn, I'm like, that's not the story of Jesus. If it was that God was against my enemies, he would have taken out Ishmael in the desert, and he didn't. So it can't be that God is just on this rampage, angry for people that don't think like I think. Repent, burn, like the whole Westboro Baptist concept, like that cannot be Jesus. And actually what it does is it confuses the story of Jesus. So like I hope my movie is that I became someone out of who I originally was. I became someone who could love and forgive and be merciful and gracious and like be the leader that God has created me to be. I hope that the story is like, if he did that with that, that's a story of Jesus, because that's what I would want. And that's what's crazy is that same Jesus, then anybody that is willing sees it, is like, well, then what can you do for me? Well, perfect. My life has become a story that's allegorical.
Yeah. Have you seen The Matrix?
Yes.
It's kind of like you can see it as.
I've heard that.
I actually rewatched it recently because the first time I watched it, it was just I was watching a glowing rectangle.
Right.
But then the second time I was actually watching it.
Was it more true the second time that you watched it? Of like, oh.
Yeah. I mean, the whole concept of everybody's in this, world. And then somebody's like, talking to the person from outside the world saying, hey, you're in this thing.
Yeah.
Come with me and we can see what reality is.
And I think that it just, to me, scratches the surface. Then when we get to heaven, even our parameters are a joke. Like the reason Jesus had to become human was to give us a God that we could conceptualize. Because the truth of God, the truth of who God was, we can't even begin to fathom. We can't even begin to imagine. And so if it wasn't for Jesus, God would have been like, how do you describe love? How do you describe hope? How do you describe peace? It has to be a person.
Yeah.
Love has to be a person. Hope has to be a person. Peace has to be a person, or else we misinterpret it.
Why do you think stories impact people so much?
We find ourselves in them. Any story that you listen to or read or get into, you find yourself in it. You create yourself as one of the characters. And by connecting to one of the characters, you kind of almost get on a roller coaster with that person, with that character. Like everybody wants to be the hero. Everybody likes to be the hero. But when you find a character that you connect to, then you get to watch what you perceive that you would have done in that scenario.
Yeah.
You know, like when you read your children bedtime stories, our children are little and they still find themselves in every single story. It gives you an identity. I think it's the development of an identity, because a lot of times we connect with this guy that we want to be. Sure. But if we were being honest, like we maybe would connect with somebody that we more are, you know? And so it's just kind of that wrestling with the concept of identity, of who are we really?
Is there any stories that stand out to you, you know, movies, songs, like in the Bible? I mean, whatever that like impacted you. I mean, obviously in the Bible. But
one story that stands out is, I think it's Mark chapter 9. I should know this. Is my favorite. But the guy that said, when Jesus says, "Do you believe?" Because I put myself instantly in that story, because I grew up in the concept of legalism.
Do you believe, and help me in my unbelief?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I find myself in the story just with the question, because I remember going to youth camp. Like, do you have faith? And I'm like, oh, I think so. How much do I have to have? I'm like, oh, if you're not healed, I was told this at youth camp. If you're not healed, it's because you don't have enough faith. And I'm like, well, how do I've been presented with that question. Sure. I've literally been presented with that question that Jesus asked, well, do you believe? And his answer was so much more honest than my answer, because I was such a little hypocrite. And I was like, yeah, for sure. I'm super, like, you bet. This guy says, I want to believe, but help my unbelief. Now what we've done, talking about stories, I've now seen someone who said what I wish that I could say. And I'm like, okay. So then you go to Jesus and you're like, okay, assume I said that. Let's just assume for a second that you asked me a hard question and I knew that I couldn't live up to the standard, and I was honest enough to say that. Hypothetically, what would you say? And Jesus goes, yeah, I want to believe, but help my unbelief. And Jesus goes, I'll take care of it. I'll fill in what you can't do. Knowing that that's who Jesus is then makes the story great. Because if Jesus would have gone, well, sorry, not enough, I'd be like, crap, that's what I assumed. That's what I thought. But Jesus's answer in a story is allegorical for me, because I look at what that guy said to Jesus and I look at Jesus's answer, and it gives me hope today that if I go to Jesus and I'm like, I'm there. I want to believe that you've got a plan. I want to believe that you're working and all this, but I can't piece it together. So could you just drag me along as my faith is lacking? And Jesus goes, yeah. I mean, the peace that I get from that story is immeasurable.
Is there, what are some other allegories in the Bible that stand out to you, that like you can think back to?
David being a shepherd.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just so anti-establishment, and not like anarchy. I just mean that God was never going to like the masses going, hey, what do you guys think? And in fact, the one person that would have lived up to that was Saul, and Saul became sort of an abomination. But that God went to somebody that was the lowest of the lowest of the low and told a story through David that we still tell today. There's a theory, actually, and you can't preach this because it's not proven, but there's a theory that David was illegitimate, and that's why his dad didn't even bring him into the house, because David represented something shameful even in his own home. That it's possible. Like later, David said, I was this shameful thing. Well, if David knew what shame was, and yet he was elevated out of the fields, then what that tells me is that God has been doing this thing where sometimes he takes elevated people, and sometimes he finds David in the back of a sheep field, shameful profession. I mean, there's a good probability that he was illegitimate and shameful in his own house, and that when the prophet said, hey, do you have any more sons? It's very probable that he was like, I didn't even want you to know that David existed because of what it says about me. that even to his own earthly father, he was a shameful thing, and that God brings him up, and against all odds, like that to me, and that David throughout never forgot that.
Right.
You know, that even in his mistakes, he was willing to own, like, hey, I only got here because you found me and brought me into a position. And like he never, even in his mistakes, he never walked away from the original starting point, which was shameful amongst shameful.
Yeah. Dang. I mean, that's what I got. Those are the things.
It's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, and these are always probably going to be short because it's just like almost directional.
Yeah.
Versus if we were just doing a podcast about whatever, I mean, we can go down everything versus these have kind of a structure almost.
Well, I'm excited because I literally expected to go, could some people Google this for me pretty quick?
Well,
Bo did save me once on the submitted. It's a great point. I think my brain can hold about 3 sermons worth of material. Okay. I had a buddy send me a video that he'd found of a sermon that I preached a couple years ago, and I watched it back. I'm like in tears, like, that's such a good point. I don't even remember preaching it. That's a great point. But again, my attention span is like, I can add one, but then one falls off.
Yeah.
And so the fear is like, oh, great. We're not going to tap into the 3 sermon material.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, we're going to do this next week. Guys, if you have questions or topics that you want to go over, send them to, or direct message them to us, or you comment on a YouTube video or whatever. Share it with your friends because a follow or a like always helps us a lot. So anyway, thank you, Jordan. We'll see everyone next week.